What happens when you cast a vote in a major U.S. election? Several things, as it turns out, none of which are good. To begin with, voting integrates you into the left-right paradigm and causes you to become more receptive to the commands of the political leaders you voted for. By voting for a politician who ends up winning the election, you've unconsciously given your tacit consent to be governed, which is another way of saying dominated by the political system your vote represents. But even if the candidate you voted for loses, you've still given your rubber stamp of approval to be subject to the mandates and directives of the political system the voting supports. Think of voting as a type of wedding in which you are married into the political system and lend it legitimacy by pledging your loyalty and assent to it. Voting for any candidate, regardless of the political party they represent, also allows the political system to weaponize your vote against you. The fiction that America is a so-called democracy rather than a republic as the Founding Fathers intended is given credence when people vote, for it allows the powers that be to use the votes of the average citizen as an excuse to create new rules, regulations, and taxes over the people under the assumption that the majority are okay with being told what to do by the government. If any of the government's policies fail or backfire, the politicians can then claim that it's your fault since, after all, you voted for it. This is one way in which voting is weaponized, and it affords politicians an easy excuse for getting out of difficulties involving their own failed policies or corruption. You may have heard the protests that, well, if you don't vote, you have no right to complain. Actually, just the opposite is true. If you don't vote, you have every right to complain about unjust policies since you did nothing to enable them. In fact, to the contrary, it's those who vote who have no right to complain when the poor policies enacted by those who they voted for are put into law. What's more, voting can also be compared to a type of intelligence test in which the voter is offered two false choices, or put another way, two evil candidates in which you're asked to choose which one of the two you consider to be the lesser of the two evils. Think of it this way. Voting is like entering a restaurant and looking at the menu, only to find out that there's just two food items on the menu. The first is cockroach casserole, and the second is sewer salad. Would anyone be foolish enough to actually make that choice instead of immediately turning around and leaving the restaurant? Well, when it comes to voting, if you take the bait and vote for either one of the bad candidates, you've shown not only a lack of discernment, but you've signaled to the ruling class that you're foolish enough to make a false choice and therefore you're ripe to be abused by them through unjust laws and mandates. With the major U.S. presidential election coming up this November, it should be clear that the two party candidates being offered to voters are both bad choices, with neither of them worthy to be president. The correct choice in such a case, therefore, is clear. Avoid the temptation to vote, and in doing so, don't give your rubber stamp approval to be governed to the point of enslavement. Instead, refuse to vote, and by doing so, you'll actually be sending a message to the Washington establishment that you don't consent to be governed by bad policies and bad politicians. Now, you might protest, well, if I don't vote, someone else will, and the bigger of the two evils may end up winning the election. In truth, if a sizable number of Americans refuse to vote, the ruling class would realize they no longer have a mandate to lord it over us, and they'd be forced to pull back on much of their tyrannical plans due to a lack of moral support. Remember, it's part of their code that they must get your tacit permission to govern you before they try and strip you of your basic human rights and thereby enslave you. So, with that said, this November, do the right thing and just say no to voting. Your future and the future of the country might just depend on it.